So when do you need to start worrying about all of this? For now, the DoD plans to initiate this plan in fiscal year 25 as soon as DFARS 252.204-7021 is updated and becomes effective. Upon the effective date, contracts that will involve FCI will require CMMC Level 1 self-assessments as a condition of contract award and might also include CMMC Level 2 self-assessments on certain contracts. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm Katie Dodson, and I'm glad you've joined us today. Hopefully, you've been following all of our great approachable cybersecurity content on social media, but if you haven't, you can find us on all the major channels under @Hive Systems. Make sure to give us a follow and subscribe. In today's episode, we're going to dive into the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, a DoD-led program for protecting controlled unclassified information, or CUI. My goal is to help you better understand it in its latest form and set your organization up for success to meet the requirements without over-designing or overspending. Let's get into it. We'll start with the basics: what it is, how it came to be, and how it builds on current requirements. Our CMMC journey dates all the way back to November 2010, when Executive Order 13556 established a program for managing unclassified information that requires safeguarding and dissemination controls. From there, DFARS Clause 252.204-7012 dictated that any company seeking to pursue a government contract that would involve processing, transmitting, or storing controlled unclassified information, again, CUI, would need to implement NIST SP 800-171 Revision 2 controls. This control framework specifically involves 110 different controls around protecting CUI. These are the bare minimum requirements for government contracts that we see today: protecting federal contract information, or FCI, through FAR 52.204-21, and protecting CUI through DFARS 252.204-7012. Then came the CMMC program. Initially announced in September 2020, CMMC 1.0 established a number of different levels and compliance requirements to validate that DIB companies were actually effectively implementing NIST 800-171. This was quickly followed by several new DFARS clauses. 252.204-7019, which established the NIST 800-171 self-assessment and triennial assessment requirements. 252.204-7020, giving the DoD the right to conduct compliance assessments, and 252.204-7021, requiring that CMMC levels are defined in the contract solicitations as a condition of contract award. The initial CMMC 1.0 program was met with a lot of uproar in the community and underwent an internal review in March 2021, only 6 months after its initial announcement. PMO took this opportunity to completely overhaul the CMMC program and announced CMMC 2.0 in November 2021, which we will review in more detail later in this presentation. So what changed from CMMC 1.0 to 2.0? The initial CMMC model was convoluted, to say the least. There were 5 different levels with varying practices and processes, and some levels required third-party assessments while others did not. After reviewing the public comments, PMO streamlined the model to simply 3 levels and realigned the practices with existing federal requirements. Now, the foundational level only needs to meet the 15 basic practices already established in FAR 52.205-21 and no longer requires a costly third-party assessment. Instead, companies can conduct a self-assessment on an annual basis to note their compliance with these 15 practices. Moving up to level 2, which focuses on protecting CUI, companies will have to implement NIST 800-171 controls and may have the option to self-assess or have a third-party assessment every 3 years. We'll get into that later. Finally, the third level focuses on protecting CUI on more critical programs that may be targets of APTs. Companies at this level have to implement NIST 800-171 as well as a handful of controls from NIST 800-172. If you're a DIB company intending to pursue DoD contracts as a prime or as a subcontractor, the CMMC program and its requirements are going to apply to you. If you're going to have FCI or CUI in the performance of the contract, you will need to make sure the proper controls are implemented and assessed appropriately. It will not apply to government information systems operated by contractors on behalf of the government. How do you know what level you need to meet, whether you need a third-party assessment, and when this has to be done by? That's going to be determined by the DoD. The CMMC level and requirements for self-assessment versus certification are going to be written directly into the solicitation, and by the end of the CMMC implementation period, it will be a condition of contract award. Any cloud service providers in use must be at least FedRAMP moderate or equivalent if they're in the scope of your assessment, and other external service providers that are not CSPs must be certified to the same level as the prime or sub that's using them. Essentially, if CUI is going to be processed, stored, or transmitted on an external service provider and the contract requires the prime to be CMMC Level 2 certified, then the external service provider in use must also be CMMC Level 2 certified. In this example, this means they will have to have gone through a C3PAO assessment for you to be able to use them in performance of the contract. As previously mentioned, the new DFARS clauses establish the flow-down requirements for CMMC level. If your subcontractor will only touch FCI and not CUI, then they only need to be CMMC Level 1 compliant. They can conduct a self-assessment against the 15 control requirements and upload their score into SPURS, which we will get into more later as well. If the sub will be processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, they will need to be at least CMMC Level 2. And if the contract states the prime must be certified, then the sub must be certified as well. No self-assessment allowed. So when do you need to start worrying about all of this? The DoD released their implementation plan with the public comment period closing in late January. At this time, they have not responded to the comments, so this may be subject to change. For now, the DoD plans to initiate this plan in fiscal year 25 as soon as DFARS 252.204-7021 is updated and becomes effective. Upon the effective date, contracts that will involve FCI will require CMMC Level 1 self-assessments as a condition of contract award and might also include CMMC Level 2 self-assessments on certain contracts. DoD may, at their discretion, decide to defer the compliance requirement to an option year instead. Then, 6 months later, CMMC Level 2 certification assessments will come into play. At this point, any new contract involving CUI or FCI will need to have either the applicable self-assessment or C3PAO assessment in place to be eligible for award. CMMC Level 3 may be required on a few contracts at this point as well. 1 year later, CMMC Level 2 certification will be required on all contracts as a condition of contract award where they apply, and to exercise option periods on contracts awarded prior to the start of the phase-in plan. So what that means is at this point, if the contract is involving CUI, you will either have to have your self-assessment or the certification completed as a condition of contract award and to continue to exercise option periods on contracts involving CUI that existed prior to the effective date of DFARS 252.204-7021. CMMC Level 3 will also now be included as a condition of contract award as well, unless the DoD decides to delay to an option period at their discretion. Finally, 1 year after all of this, so at this point, 30 months after the effective date of DFARS 252.204-7012, all CMMC requirements will be in place for all contracts with the DoD as a condition of contract award and on all option periods, regardless of whether those contracts were awarded prior to or after the beginning of the implementation plan. So breaking down what that means for each phase. That means you can see exactly how many controls need to be in place from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. So for phase 1, if the contract is only going to involve FCI and the requirement is only CMMC Level 1, you will need to have the 15 FAR 52.204-21 requirements in place, and will have to have conducted a self-assessment, upload the results into SPURS, and have a senior official affirm that the compliance that you are compliant with those 15 requirements. At the same time, if you are bidding on a contract that requires a CMMC Level 2 self-assessment, You will need to have all 110 NIST 800-171 Rev 2 controls in place. We'll have to conduct a self-assessment and upload the results into SPURS, and have a senior official affirm that you are compliant. At this point, CMMC Level 1 does not allow any POAMs. We'll get into that later as well. CMMC Level 2 does allow POAMs on certain controls. So there are some that you may be able to resolve after the completion of the assessment. In phase 2, we are getting into all of the CMMC Level 2. So at this point, any contract involving CMMC Level 1 will already be taken care of. You definitely need to have those 15 controls in place. But here, all 110 NIST 800-171 controls will need to be in place for any contract involving CUI. And depending on the contract, you may have to either complete a self-assessment or hire a third-party C3PAO to conduct a certification assessment. These assessments need to be done every 3 years, and the C3PAO will upload the results into EMAS rather than into SPURS. They do translate over, so you don't have to worry about uploading the results yourself. Again, CMMC Level 2 does allow for POAMs, so there are some controls that you will be able to finish implementing after the assessment if necessary, if any gaps are identified. And then in phase 3, we get into CMMC Level 3. So that will be the 110 controls from NIST 800-171 that need to be in place, as well as the additional 24 controls from NIST 800-172. The DoD will conduct the assessment at the Level 3 and will upload the results into EMAS as well. So now we'll really dive into the meat of things, what each of the CMMC levels are, who they apply to, and how that could impact your company and contracts. As previously mentioned, CMMC Level 1 focuses in on protecting the federal contract information, or FCI. At this level, the 15 controls from FAR 52.204-21 need to be in place, and the assessment requirements are simply an annual self-assessment. So your company will need to go in and make sure that you are compliant with each of these 15 controls. The way that you do that assessment is by following the CMMC Level 1 assessment guide, which uses a combination of interviews, examination of evidence, and testing to validate your compliance with the control. At Level 1, no POAMs are allowed. So in order to pass this assessment, all 15 controls need to be in place and operating effectively. The scope for this assessment are any assets that process, store, or transmit FCI. Any sort of specialized assets that do process, store, or transmit FCI but cannot be fully secured. So those are things like Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, operational technology, government furnished equipment, and restricted information systems and test equipment are not going to be in scope for the CMMC Level 1 assessment. After the assessment is complete, you do have to log into SPURS, and you will have to upload your CMMC level, the assessment date and scope, applicable cage codes for any system that is in the scope of the assessment, and your compliance results. So pass or fail, basically at this point. As I previously mentioned, as part of the CMMC program, every company will need to have a senior official selected who is going to affirm on an annual basis that you are continuing to comply with your CMMC level. So in this case, at CMMC Level 1, that would likely be done after the completion of the annual assessment. But as we see with later CMMC levels, you will still need to attest annually, even if the assessment is done every 3 years instead of annually. This is just a list of the different controls that are required at Level 15, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but the types of controls that need to be in place include authorized access control, transaction and function control, external connections, control public information, identification, authentication, media disposal, limit physical access, manage visitors and physical access, boundary protection, public access system separation, flaw remediation, malicious code protection, update malicious code protection, and system and file scanning. CMMC Level 2 is probably where most DoD contractors will fall, if not Level 3. CMMC Level 2 focuses on protecting controlled unclassified information, and it must be protected by the 110 NIST 800-171 Revision 2 controls. Depending on your contract, you may be able to do a self-assessment, just like at level 1, or you may be required to get an assessment from a certified third-party group, a C3PAO, to actually conduct the assessment and give you a certification status that you have met all of the requirements. Regardless of the type of assessment, they need to be conducted every 3 years. So CMMC level 1 was annually for those 15 requirements. Level 2 is every 3 years for the 110. The assessments follow NIST 800-171A for the assessment criteria. There's also a CMMC level 2 assessment guide that came along with all of the documentation for the CMMC program. And that still involves a combination of interviews, examination of evidence, or testing. There is no draft documentation allowed for a CMMC level 2 assessment. It all has to be final versions of your documentation. Another thing to note is in order to even conduct a CMMC level 2 assessment, whether a self-assessment or a certification assessment, you do need to have a completed system security plan talking about how all of your controls are implemented. The assessment follows the DoD's scoring methodology, which is pretty unique. You start with an overall score of 110, and each control is assigned a weight of 5, 3, or 1. If even one of the assessment criteria for that control is not met, then the entire control is considered not met, and the associated points are deducted from the overall score of 110. In order to pass the assessment, you need to score 88 or higher, which brings me to the use of POAMs. At CMMC level 2, certain controls are allowed to have a POAM if they are not met at the time of the assessment. Now, the only controls that are allowed to have a POAM do score a 1, so there are definitely a number of controls that you cannot POAM at all. And even if you do have a POAM, you need to remediate that within 180 days of the assessment and then complete a POAM closeout assessment to confirm that the control is now met. So there's only a limited number of POAMs you can have in order to still get an 80%. You then have to remediate them with 180 days and conduct a POAM closeout assessment. If you do have POAMs, your status will be a conditional certification until the POAM closeout assessment is complete. Again, SPRS inputs, if you're doing a self-assessment, are going to be the same as level 1. So your CMMC level, assessment date and scope, cage codes, and compliance result. The only thing that changes here is your use of POAMs, and the senior official must annually attest to continued compliance and must attest after every assessment. So we do the assessments every 3 years. Your senior official is going to attest to continued compliance. But then if you had POAMs and have a POAM closeout assessment as well, they will need to attest again for the POAM closeout assessment. If you do a certification assessment through a C3PAO, they will take care of uploading all of the information related to your assessment into EMAS, which will automatically port the data over into SPRS. However, your senior official will still have to go into SPRS to upload their attestation. Getting into the scope is a little more complicated for CMMC level 2 because of the use of CUI. So while level 1 only included assets that process, store, and transmit federal contract information, level 2 includes assets that process, store, and transmit CUI, assets that provide security functions and capabilities, such as your logging tools, even if they don't process, store, and transmit CUI. It also includes contractor risk-managed assets, and specialized assets that we specifically noted were out of scope for level 1 may be in scope for level 2. It's very important to note that if you are planning to do a CMMC level 3 assessment, your scope for your level 2 assessment has to be identical to what you will be doing for your level 3 assessment. Otherwise, you'll have to do the CMMC level 2 assessment again to make sure that the scope matches. So just make sure if you intend to pursue level 3, that your scope for level 2 is the same. If you're using a cloud service provider to process, store, or transmit CUI, as I previously mentioned, the CSP must be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. In the event that you get assessed by a C3PAO and don't agree with the results, you can contest them at any point during the assessment by offering additional evidence to remediate any not met controls, and you can continue to contest for up to 10 business days after to try to remediate any gaps in your assessment. All evidence must be retained for at least 6 years. And it's important to note that while you may be providing evidence during the assessment to your C3PAO, the evidence, because of the nature of the CUI and the security of the documentation, will not be provided directly into EMAS. Instead, you will follow the CMMC hashing guide to hash the artifacts and then provide a list of the hashes. That piece is what's going to be uploaded into EMAS. So in order to even get back to your documentation and your evidence, you're going to have to follow the hashing guide, and the C3PAO will work with you on that as well. But this is an effort to protect the evidence that you are uploading and providing to your assessors. So rather than getting into all the different 110 controls that are going to be involved for CMMC Level 2, here we're just going to show a breakdown of the different control families in play and how many controls can and cannot be POAM for each of those control families. So as you can see here, there's quite a lot of controls around access and system and communications protection. And then there's just a few around, for example, personnel security and awareness and training. You can see in yellow how many of the controls for that family can have a POAM. Again, keeping in mind that you need to pass with at least a score of 88 in order to even be considered a conditional certified organization through the CMMC Level 2 assessment. But personnel security, security assessment and authorization, and system and information integrity all don't allow for any POAMs at all. So it's important to note your C3PAO or a consultant can help you understand which controls can and cannot be POAM'd, especially based on the DoD scoring methodology. But there are many controls that you definitely have to have in place no matter what before going in for your assessment. And finally, we get into CMMC Level 3. As previously mentioned, CMMC Level 2 is a prerequisite for CMMC Level 3. You must implement all of the Level 2 controls from NIST 800-171 and successfully complete a C3PAO certification assessment prior to going for your Level 3 assessment. At this level, the focus is on protecting CUI with additional considerations for advanced persistent threats. So at this point, you're adding in an additional 24 controls from NIST 800-172. After completing your CMMC Level 2 assessment and making sure that you have completed with no POAMs, you can go in for the DIBCAC assessment for Level 3. So at this point, it is not the C3PAO that will do the assessment of the 24 controls from 800-172. You will contract directly with DCMA DIBCAC for this part of the assessment. Again, no draft documentation is allowed, and the criteria for the assessments is going to follow 800-172A. POAMs are allowed on certain controls at this level as well. Again, they have to be remediated within 180 days of the assessment. There needs to be a POAM closeout assessment if you did have any POAMs, and you do still have to score an 80% or higher. DIBCAC will also use EMAS similar to the C3PAO, and your senior official, again, will need to go into SPURS to upload their annual attestation, as well as an attestation after every assessment, including POAM closeouts. Something that's important to note here is that DIBCAC, if for any reason feels that they need to test some of your Level 2 requirements, they can. They do reserve the right to check on the completion of those controls if they suspect that there's something is documented as met but might not actually be met. If they find during their check that the control actually has not been met at the Level 2 requirement, it could result in putting your Level 3 assessment on hold or terminating it altogether. So that just goes to show how important it is to have your Level 2 assessment completed and everything remediated before you get to the Level 3 status for your assessments. As I previously mentioned, your scope for Level 3 has to be identical to Level 2, and most of the assets that are in scope are going to be the same as what you saw at Level 3. The only difference is it does not include contractor risk managed assets, and it does include assets that can but are not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI. Specialized assets are assessed against CMMC requirements unless they are physically or logically isolated with no connection to the internet or other networks. And then external service providers might also be included if the data must reside on those ESP assets. Some additional considerations. So I mentioned before that DIBCAC does reserve the right to check on whether or not you have any level 2 controls that are actually not met during their assessment. And if they are not, it could put your level 3 assessment on hold or terminate it altogether. But another thing that's important to note is if your level 2 certification is revoked for any reason, it automatically also revokes your level 3 status. And then this list just shows the additional 24 controls that are from NIST 800-172 that need to be in place for level 3. So that includes threat-guided intrusion detection, specialized asset security, integrity verification, isolation, penetration testing, supply chain risk plan, supply chain risk response, security solution effectiveness, security solution rationale, advanced risk identification, threat hunting, threat-informed risk assessments, adverse information, cyber incident response team, security operations center, block untrusted assets, bidirectional authentication, automated inventory, automated detection and remediation, authoritative repository, practical training exercises, advanced threat awareness, secured information transfer, and organizationally controlled assets. So now that we've talked through the CMMC levels and associated controls, there's one other item to address, NIST 800-171 Revision 3. Right now, all of the DFARS language and CMMC guidance indicate that CMMC Level 2 and Level 3 must meet NIST 800-171 Revision 2 specifically. However, Revision 3 just ended their public comment period after their final draft version was released, and that ended on January 26th of 2024. So at this time, no additional documentation has come out, but after reviewing those public comments, it is likely that Revision 3 will go out for final publication and ultimately replace Revision 2. There was some significant rework between Level 2 and Level 3. We do have another Hive Live series that talks about a detailed breakdown of the changes for NIST 853 Revision 5. The rework from 800-171 was specifically to align with 853 Revision 5. So in the past, Revision 2 would be a simple 1 to 2 sentence control. Now it's going to have parts and subparts just like 853. So some of the things to consider from that, 49 of the 110 controls now have additional requirements because of that breakout of parts and subparts for the control. There are also 14 entirely new control requirements for 800-171 that did not previously exist in Revision 2. 27 of the controls have been incorporated into other existing controls. So while that does not necessarily have a direct impact on what needs to be implemented from Rev 2 to Rev 3, it does show kind of the rework of some of the controls to consolidate and make them make a little bit more sense and align with existing frameworks. And then 7 of the controls were removed entirely. So unfortunately, that does mean you have to have them in place for Revision 2, even though they're going to be obsolete for Revision 3. For as long as the DoD guidance requires Revision 2. So at this time, DoD has not indicated whether they intend to change requirements from Revision 2 to Revision 3, or when that would be changed. However, it is important when planning for implementing some of these controls and for planning ahead that we also consider future-proofing by incorporating the Revision 3 requirements into the process. So that breaks down everything we know so far about the DoD implementation plan. More information will continue to come out as the public comments are analyzed and responded to, and as Rule DFARS 2019-D041 is published. So that other rule is going to dictate when the effective date of the DFARS clause and implementation of the CMMC program will start. We will continue to monitor for updates and release ACT posts or additional Hive Live episodes to make sure we're sharing the most up-to-date information available. That's all the time we have today. I hope you feel ready to take on CMMC compliance, and when you need help accelerating your journey to compliance, you can reach out at www.hivesystems.com/contact us. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted for our next episode by going to www.hivesystems.com/hivelive. Next month, we're going to be doing the video review of the release of our 2024 password table, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel at www.hivesystems.com/hivelive. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react.